And thank you for joining us on our latest Power Session webinar topic, Bridging the Skills Gap, Workforces for Electrification. My name is Ezra Beeman, and I will be walking you through the topic today. We're going to start with some housekeeping and introductions. Then we'll focus on the drivers of changes to workforce needs, workforce impact assessment, and workforce solution development. And then summarize what we've learned in key takeaways and recommendations, and end with a brief discussion of our next Power Session webinar. So the webinar is going to be recorded and distributed to all registrants along with this presentation. You are welcome to add any questions you have to the chat. My associate, Sarah Gonzalez, will be monitoring that and will be curating them at the end. We will also have a voting topic for future webinars, and hopefully you'll see things in there that are interesting. Please do vote. We do weigh that heavily in our forward agenda. So as I said, I'm Ezra Beeman. I'm Managing Director. I look after the US and Australian operations. I have a background in the industry, having worked for Ausgrid, and now I look after Energeia as well as a startup solar battery manufacturer named Empower. So let's turn to the first topic, which is drivers of changes to workforce needs. So I think a lot of us are very much focused on the transition itself. What do we need to do to transition away from CO2 in our economy, particularly in power sector and the other sectors, and maybe less on the drivers of these transitions, as well as the workforce needed to enable them. So here we have the historic and targeted CO2 emissions across the Kyoto and Paris agreements, and at the present time, you can see Australia's target is declining, with a the Paris Agreement update target out to 2030. Now, ultimately, there's been a commitment to net zero by 2050, and I think if we showed the longer term time horizon, you'll see how we're really going to have to pick up the game to hit those targets. Here we have the outlook to 2050, and we're sitting here in 2025. The federal trajectory here so far, we've had it pretty gradual, but now it really needs to be heading downwards at pace. You see some of the other states like the ACT in particular has committed to a 2045 timeline. I also believe that Victoria did as well. And in terms of what that means for each of the states, well, it varies. You can see the emissions set before us here, and the larger states, economically speaking, have the largest amount of emissions to abate. And we have a number of other webinars, if you're interested, that cover off on industrial energy efficiency, transport energy efficiency, as well as electricity. Sorry, I said energy efficiency, I meant decarbonization. And you are encouraged to check those out. So, unlike previous webinars where we really dived into the economics, the pathways, this time we're focusing on what I think is a largely unrecognized factor that is essential to the success of the transition, and that's the workforce. How do we actually train the right people in enough quantity to actually achieve these transition targets? And so we're going to share with you some of the ways that we've done this and some of the projects that we've done, including case studies from Australia. So as I mentioned, there are a number of different pathways that are going to impact on the workforce. This is just a summary of them: building electrification, transport electrification, gas sector decarbonization, potentially decommissioning, transport sector decarbonization, and power sector decarbonization. That covers most of it. You could put in the industrial sector as well. In this webinar, we're going to be looking at everything that is in black and the grays. We just don't have the projects at the moment to include that. in our webinar. We hope to in future. All right, so let's look at particular projects that we've done in building electrification, gas sector, decarbonization, and then a case study that was done for ARENA, looking at the electric utility, 100% renewables transition, and then finally the gas system decommissioning. So this work was done for a state jurisdiction in Australia, and in this we were looking at the impacts, particularly in field trades, of different policies for decarbonizing the gas sector. And so we looked at various different categories of labor, and we sort of showed over time what the total number was. Now they've been removed because that report's not been published. But I want to draw your attention to the gradual nature of the business as usual, and then looking at no gas in new premises in 2023. It's also gradual from about 2023, and you see HVAC rise. You see gas sort of decline as the buildings decline. But then we looked at scenarios where we also said we considered the scenario of no new gas appliances sold from 2024. And you can see there that there is a massive jump in the number of FTEs required if you no longer sold gas appliances and only electrical appliances. And a key insight from that piece of work was just that the policy needed to be really careful with respect to the workforce. Now, aside from whether or not you can turn on the tap of electric only appliances in the global supply chain, there is the issue that you would need to actually have significant disruptions to the current workforce for this kind of policy. So ultimately, we recommended that you would stagger any sort of bans with enough forewarning so that the training system could actually start to enable that sort of a workforce to be developed. So turning to a project we did for a state in the U.S., you can see here there were a number of different scenarios, from business as usual to looking at carbon-free fuels, dual fuel sort of strategy. They have a particularly cold climate in this state, looking at energy efficiency, cold climate, heat pumps, electrification, and a thermal system, a thermal utility to replace the gas utility. And they had different scenarios of reductions in gas consumption. You can see we looked at the total gas utility sector employment. And then we also included estimated effort for replacing or installing a base electric appliance versus a heat pump versus a cold climate, etc. And then what we did was we mapped the different scenarios across gas utility, electric utility, and gas and electric trade jobs. And generally speaking, you can see that the pathway had significant impacts on the workforce, with a heat utility ramping up, significantly growing over time, even though maybe not as big as the current gas utility. And likewise in gas, to the extent we went to an electrified scenario, the gas labor would fall. Now, this is fine and what you would expect from moving away from one sector into another. I think the other thing to highlight is just the timing. Here we're showing significant appliance adoption under these scenarios from about the 2030 to 2035 timeframe. And this is really critical when you're trying to ensure that the workforce is ready. Same on the electricity utility jobs. It really is a function of how much peak demand and what the sort of resource mix looks like in terms of what sort of jobs and how many are driven. On the trade side, this is all really related to the change out of appliances in the field. So we were also engaged by a leading utility in the US that is vertically integrated, and they had very ambitious zero carbon targets for their purchases, but also for their wider networks. And one of the things that they realized was just how important workforce was going to be for that. And so they had a profile here, and this was just for 10 years in the project that we did. And it mapped out what the expenditure meant in terms of field force, parts of the business dealing with the programs, energy efficiency, building electrification, etc. The engineering core, particularly as they had to engineer more substations, etc., to accommodate the ramp up of distributed energy resources as well as peak demand. And then the additional generation or GX investment here. So this was the planned expenditure. Now here we've turned that into incremental FTEs, and you can see that not everything is not one for one. That some of these were more FTE intensive. Now this clearly doesn't provide a lot of detail, but I think we wanted to put it forward as an example of anyone who is out there that's in the vanguard that is looking to lead in this area. This type of work is being undertaken and being undertaken successfully. They identified what their training gaps were. They identified what they needed to do in terms of revising many of their role descriptions, as well as to be more competitive and also to make good buy versus make decisions in terms of their workforce. So turning to the work we did in the ACT, now this is published, so we can reveal actual numbers. And here we were looking in these graphics on different scenarios around potential shutdown of the gas system. And so depending on the scenario, whether it was no intervention and that goes out sort of indefinitely, to a delayed scenario, which still saw the territory meet the 2045 commitment, but on a much slower basis, to an accelerated one. And you can imagine tapering or impacting on the workforce in a consistent or consonant way. And so again, if these are the sorts of plans that are being carried out in different jurisdictions, they will have significant impacts on the nature and the mix of workforce needs, and it's really important that these are not forgotten about. And so it's good in this project that we did have an opportunity to look at these effects, um, uh, and it's important that each state and the Commonwealth also, I think, have a deep dive into the impacts of the transition on the workforce and what's needed. So one example of that was commissioned by ARENA. Now this just focuses on the industrial sector and transitioning it to 100% renewables or decarbonizing it. And you can see here they also had to estimate the number of jobs that would be needed. Here it's split out by construction versus O&M jobs. And then they broke it out by the subsectors. So you can see FTEs needed in transmission, in the resources, in hydrogen, and in storage. And these are not insignificant numbers. I mean, we're going from 25,000 in 2020 to about 80,000 by 2030 to more than double that by 2050. So while the the pool of skilled workers will increase over time, this is calling for more than that. This is calling for, I guess, cannibalization of carbon jobs and moving them across to renewable energy jobs, which is a lot easier said than done. So in the service of that planning, here's another piece of the analysis or an example of the analysis where they looked at the carbon workforce demand by scenario in thousands, and they compared it to what the renewable energy requirements would be. And you can see here we need a lot more electricians and a lot more other technicians and trade workers, but possibly less drillers, miners, and shot firers, as well as metal fitters and machinists. So the challenge of the workforce development strategy is how do you do this in the fairest and most efficient way? And that is not something that has necessarily been a feature. I mean, generally, things have not moved in the industry quite as significantly and substantially as what we're talking about in the transition. This other slide highlights some of the higher and versus lower skilled jobs, those that are most in demand, and then what our current situation is in Australia in terms of whether there's a shortage or not shortage. And unsurprisingly, in Australia, most of these jobs are in shortage. And if this issue and this situation is not worked out, then the targeted timelines for decarbonization and electrification just simply cannot be met. There will not be enough people to do the work. All right, so let's talk about some methods and approaches for developing these solutions to workforce needs, with a specific focus on Australia. So, if you look at the data from the vocational education and training data set, you can see that most of the providers are private training, not only in terms of the count of these organizations, but in how many students have been enrolled. You can see generally they're flat, declining, slightly growing, except for the private training, which has seen quite a significant amount of growth over the last few years. Now, in thinking about what we just saw in terms of the amount of training needed, um, it's not just the same as adding that many new workers, which you'd have to change your immigration policies to achieve, or have a really fat baby bonus. It's as much around ensuring that folks that want to retrain, or that are coming in are training in growth occupations and not occupations that will see a declining use. In terms of the actual level of qualification needed to achieve certification, as it says here, that certificate threes are required to become a licensed tradesperson, and you'll see that they tend to have the highest level of completions. Um, and you can see we've got enrollments versus completion. So, trying to improve on that ratio is also a key strategy of businesses we've worked with. It's not just about it's not only about hiring more folks into the training pipeline, but also supporting them and helping them be successful to graduate from that pipeline. Okay, so we did in one of our projects in the US, we tried to identify the key workforce barriers. You can find information online, and we did do the research, but we also interviewed a number of people who had operated in the field trades. How did they actually operate their business? How did they attract new talent? How did they develop that talent? And what were some of the key barriers that they saw? And so the key barriers that we identified, obviously, competitiveness of wages. There is some stigma. This might be more of an issue in the U.S. than Australia, of blue collar stigma. I think, yeah. In terms of view as to whether the incentive's going to be there for the long term. I mean, there's no use ramping up your business to target a sector and then to find the subsidies pulled from under your feet. Um, in the research, we found declining interest in energy sector jobs, shrinking pool of workers due to birth rate, lack of accessibility to training, entry requirements, and cost of transition to alternate trades. All is significant issues. So, in terms of the solutions to these issues, or the responding to these issues, we did some analysis of how the trades stack up in Australia, and you can see that electricians, HVAC technicians, and plumbers are paid relatively well. So that's great, and will attract a lot of interest and new entry. But if you have to grow it more than it has in the past, that's going to have to increase the overall supply of trained people in these occupations. Now you can also see in the analysis or the data on courses with the highest change in medium income, electrotechnology, electrician, and plumbing. So these things are related here. So while it's looking good, it's going to have to improve if we're going to see that kind of change in the workforce. Now, here's a laundry list, and this came from US research in terms of how these various barriers have been addressed, or what is believed to be best practice. If you want more information around the sources used here, please reach out, and happy to tell you more about it. But I won't go through each of these. Just that there's a large body of work around workforce development and training, because it is something that's so fundamental to the economy. This particular focus was, though, on how do we train people for the energy sectors, particularly electricity. All right, now I wanted to walk you through a case study of how we actually came up with a workforce development solution and strategy. So, based on the previous research, we identified a core set, and this was actually for a city government, so like an LGA in Australia, where they wanted to achieve their electrification and building electrification targets primarily. And so they wanted to ensure they had the workforce. So this was the strategy we put to them, or at least the elements of the strategy was to offer a new entry signing bonus, to offer retraining bonuses for those that are swapping from one, particularly the gas sector, into the electricity sector, to help attract people, but also to partly offset any sort of training cost. Um, then we also recommended spending on promoting the careers themselves, make people more aware of them, and to also put an extra focus on underrepresented elements of the community to ensure that there is equal opportunity to access to the overall training opportunity. So with that, we were able to first of all, identify what the actual needs were from this electrification, and then we smoothed it because your workforce generally is going to get sort of ramped up. And then based on the additional FTEs every year, we saw a ramp up, and this is relative to the needs in the dotted line. And this was only a near-term ramp up as they were implementing particular solutions. And then after that, it was more organic in its nature. And you can see here by bringing together these different elements. With the training pipeline and having an increase based on the amount of incentives and a few other things like instant permits and streamlining process and paperwork. The more streamlined the actual administration is, the more time people are actually on the tools and not filling out paperwork. Um, but fundamentally, that was the methodology that we brought to bear here, and the similar approach would be applicable to almost any of the other um, particular applications that we presented earlier. All right. So, in terms of key takeaways and recommendations, so achieving those targets is going to require significant workforce development. Those trajectories are nothing like the natural attrition rates in any of these workforces. Um, the impacts of the transition is going to vary across the different impacted sectors very significantly by pathway. That was very much brought out by the work we were doing in a particular U.S. state. Best practice in this area includes that assessment of impacts and workforce development strategies and plans. That it cannot be just an afterthought. It really needs to be part of the core planning activity. And that when you do it, it can be used to effectively manage. At least in the examples we've worked on. I mean, first of all, you have to set reasonable timelines and policy that the workforce supply can achieve, but then through the workforce development strategies, you can help plan out the systematic moving of talent from a shrinking career path to one that's growing. However, that also is not free. And so it's really important that in addition to the money spent on electric vehicles and batteries and windmills, that we also ensure that there's commensurate amounts of investment and funding going into the workforce development. So our recommendations based on all of that is to ensure that transition policy planning includes workforce impact optimization and development activities and funding. That it's really important to engage with the workforce early to identify any issues, risks, concerns, because it's without this, there's more likely to be a risk of pushback and or lack of support, which will be really essential to the success of these transition policies. Um, Understanding the timing and mix of workforce impacts is important. Otherwise, it's difficult to ensure that the strategies will deliver a fair and timely transition, and that finally, significant education is likely to be needed across a wide range of sectors, and that we're probably behind just looking at what the needs are now. So hopefully, webinars like this and other voices will help policymakers and the people that are in the position to do something about this to act. All right, now we're to the end part, at least the part leading up to the Q&A. I appreciate that that people have places to go. So hopefully that was informative and of interest. If you have any particular questions about the work we've done or any of the topics that we've covered, please drop them into the chat and we'll turn to that in one moment. And otherwise, if you haven't already, please do vote for your favorite Power Session webinar topic. We've got 5 options here. And also, please ensure you sign up for our next Power Session in September, which is going to focus on nuclear technology and its cost effectiveness, a topic that has been very much in the media over the last few months in Australia and the US, and is a topic I'm looking forward to learning more about. So thank you. If we could then turn to any questions in the chat, I see there are a few. Do you have any insights about the location of job shortages? For example, are the challenges larger in regional remote areas? Um, we haven't done work on specific workforce needs in Australia other than in one of the states and one of the territories. But the workforce needs are going to be a function of where people live for the appliances and the field trades. In terms of developing up new renewable generation or new transmission lines, etc., that's going to be in the resource basins, any of the pathways. So I, you know, there's wind most places in Australia. There's sun most places in Australia. I think when you get into transmission lines, then that's a little bit more specific. But in terms of appliance changeouts from gas to electric, that's pretty much any more concentrated in urban and suburban environments. Thank you for the question. How do workforce demographics factor? I imagine there are untapped groups, women, career changers, and our older workers. What strategies should be in place to attract these groups? Um, so I think this is a really important question, especially when you're trying to flex in a short amount of time. I mean, a lot of these jobs, or at least the trade jobs, right, are out there in the field. So it's going to impact on certain demographics that are not that are better placed to work remotely, I suppose. Um, the other thing about retirees, et cetera, I mean, that's a huge workforce that if they could be kept in the workforce another 5 years, represents a lot of skill and a lot of capacity. But the terms have to be appropriate to retain them. Um, and in terms of women or even those that are less represented in these workforces, I think improved marketing is really important. I think a lot of policymakers and industry players underestimate the power of advertising and the importance, and not just sort of putting it anywhere, but to actually advertise in the places that these underrepresented or potential untapped segments actually can be engaged. Global mobility of resources, in particular for transmission lines construction work, is a real constraint. Experience with tactics on attracting, and inducting an international workforce. Well, so I used to work for Osgrid, and we had like a $1.5 billion zone substation program. And so we looked at, what were the options here? Could we develop them up through cadetships and through training programs? Could we go to the market, et cetera? And I mean, what we found was that there's a lot of competition for talent, from other countries, bringing them in because, in part, other major jurisdictions are doing this at the very same time. So the U.S., Australia, Europe, they're all competing for really, skilled people that can climb towers and do technical work. I mean, I think one of the real advantages that Australia has is, quality of life, but to be organized and systematic about this at the national level is, I think, one of the best ways to ensure access to these types of skill. I think it's difficult for any utility on their own to do this, and probably it's worth looking at industry collaborations as well as help from the Commonwealth that manages skilled migration to actually make this achievable. As I said, like there's no birth rate that's going to hit those sort of targets. It's a combination of all of the above. We need to uh, be able to attract more skilled workers from offshore. We need to ensure more people move into this sector and away from shrinking sectors. We need to retain more of the retiring workforce, and we need to tap into more of the underrepresented workforces. I think doing all that will enable Australia to have the best chance of having the workforce it needs to deliver the transition it's aiming for. As an energy developer, we are not a direct employer of electricians and other trades. However, we need them indirectly to be successful. How do we support closing the gap without having a direct employing role? I mean, so I think one of the most important things is a long-term plan, and to signal that plan to potential service providers. If you think the market is, it goes back to the how much do you believe in the growth of this market, and if more buyers were to say, look, this is my long-term buying plan at the moment, that would signal to suppliers and to job applicants that, hey, this is a really promising sector. I think that still all needs to be rolled up by people in the workforce industry, as well as industry associations, and it has to be um, recognized and promoted by governments. I mean, it's not this is a very difficult challenge. You can't grow people on trees or grow their training. It's a real complex system, but it's one that has works really well for what it's doing at the moment. The problem is it needs to change, and leading that change is probably going to come from the established training bodies and making them aware of the needs. So I realize we're at time. I appreciate everybody joining us for this slice of your life. I'll take a couple more, but I want to just say thank you for everybody who stayed on today. This is an important question. Is a 10 times workforce statistic about new staff or total workforce? I believe it is total workforce. So some fraction of that will be new. A large fraction of that will be new. But we're not saying, yeah, we're not expecting that to be represented in total growth of total workforce, but rather reflecting people from other parts of the workforce uh, entering into this particular industry. Huh. Do you think we can hit 2030 or 2035 targets? I mean, I believe they can be hit. The 20, but again, you saw that we're going to sort of this trajectory up till now, and now we just got to go with this much deeper trajectory. So I suspect the near term targets will be easier because there will be some flex and there will be spare capacity. But once that's used up, I think there are going to be choke points, and it will um, lead to higher shortages and wage increases, and just not being able to find enough people, and that is something that the economy experiences every time there's a commodities boom. So this is a different kind of boom, but will probably lead to similar outcomes with the labor force. What has been the most challenging part of these types of analysis? It varies from project to project. um, Sometimes it's getting the data around the projects that have to be delivered and the nature of the work, and then mapping those to the amount of resources. I mean, it's a very rare uh, utility or other type of financial system that is able to cut across HR, where you've got like pay stubs, the financial planning system, which is more of a budgeting activity, to the actual project development delivery, which might be Primavera versus SAP versus whatever you're using for HR if it's not SAP. So moving between those systems to try and bring together how it all ties together can be very challenging. And then reaching out to parts of the business that are responsible for attracting and retaining talent. Just that this sort of analysis rarely happens where it is almost a bottom up estimate of what is needed compared to just incremental change over time. All right, maybe one last question. If there is one. What should policymakers focus on in the near term? I mean, I think that's a really good question. Based on the work we've done, I think it's just getting our arms around what that looks like. I think that arena funded study is a good step. It covered a fraction of the industry. I think we need to expand that kind of analysis across the whole industry, and to have a integrated, systematic understanding of what the workforce needs to do, how it's going to be developed, and the associated roles and responsibilities and funding that's required. I mean, Australia's been very good about identifying the R&D requirements that are needed, and the low energy technology strategy, but we don't have a low carbon workforce strategy, as far as I know, and as far as we've been able to find. So I think that just that initial blueprint and roadmap for the nation as a whole would be an excellent first step. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I realize we've gone over a bit. We hope you will sign up for the next webinar on nuclear technology, and we look forward to seeing you in September. Thank you very much.